For more than half a century, a vast reservoir stretching across the desert Southwest has stood as a monument to human ambition. Yet beneath its receding waters lies a question that has become increasingly difficult to ignore. Why was one of the largest dams in the United States built despite warnings that the river feeding it might never provide enough water to sustain the grand vision behind it? Why did officials move forward with flooding one of the most extraordinary canyon landscapes in North America when doubts already existed about the project's long-term viability? And as water levels continue to decline across the Colorado River Basin, what does the slow reappearance of Glen Canyon reveal about decisions made decades ago? The story of Glen Canyon Dam and Lake Powell is not merely about engineering. It is a story of competing priorities, political compromise, environmental transformation, and a river system pushed beyond its natural limits. It is a story that began long before the dam itself was constructed, rooted in a belief that the Colorado River could be fully controlled, allocated, and harnessed to support the rapid growth of the American West. Today, as shorelines retreat and ancient canyon walls emerge from beneath falling waters, many observers are revisiting decisions made during the middle of the 20th century. The reservoir that once symbolized certainty now stands at the center of debates over water scarcity, climate change, ecosystem recovery, and the future of the Colorado River. The Colorado River originates high in the Rocky Mountains and flows through 7 American states before reaching Mexico. For thousands of years, it carved immense canyons, transported sediment across vast distances, and sustained diverse ecosystems throughout the arid Southwest. By the early 20th century, however, the river was increasingly viewed through a different lens. Growing cities, expanding agricultural regions, and rising populations created enormous demand for reliable water supplies. Government officials sought ways to tame the river and regulate its seasonal fluctuations. Flood control, irrigation development, hydropower generation, and municipal water storage became central priorities. Massive infrastructure projects emerged as symbols of progress throughout the United States, and the Colorado River became one of the most heavily engineered waterways in the world. A critical turning point came with the Colorado River Compact of 1922. This agreement divided river water between the upper basin states and the lower basin states. The compact allocated roughly equal shares to each basin, based largely on river flow estimates available at the time. Those estimates would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire Colorado River system. Hydrologic records used during negotiations happened to coincide with an unusually wet period. River flows appeared significantly larger than they truly were over the long term. As a result, water allocations were established using figures that future generations would struggle to achieve consistently. Even before Glen Canyon Dam was built, evidence existed suggesting that river flows had been overestimated. Some researchers questioned whether enough water would ultimately be available to satisfy all promises embedded within interstate agreements. Despite those concerns, momentum behind large-scale development continued to grow. The upper basin states worried that without sufficient infrastructure, they might lose access to water allocated under the compact. They sought large reservoirs capable of storing water during wet years and ensuring deliveries during dry periods. Such storage facilities would also provide hydropower revenue that could finance additional projects across the region. These objectives eventually led to the Colorado River Storage Project, authorized by Congress during the 1950s. At the heart of the plan stood a massive dam in Glen Canyon, located near the border between present-day Arizona and Utah. Glen Canyon represented one of the most spectacular landscapes along the Colorado River. Before inundation, the canyon system contained hundreds of side canyons, alcoves, natural arches, springs, hanging gardens, archaeological sites, and towering sandstone walls sculpted by millions of years of erosion. Many who visited the area described it as one of the most remarkable canyon environments in North America, yet relatively few Americans had ever seen it. The region remained remote and difficult to access compared with nearby attractions such as the Grand Canyon. As planning advanced, debate intensified over whether Glen Canyon should be preserved or sacrificed for water storage. environmental organizations faced difficult choices. Some accepted the loss of Glen Canyon in exchange for preventing dams from being constructed within the Grand Canyon itself. The political compromise reflected the priorities and realities of the era. Construction of Glen Canyon Dam began in the late 1950s. Workers excavated enormous volumes of rock and concrete foundations. The structure ultimately rose approximately 710 feet, or about 216 meters, above the riverbed. At the time of completion, it ranked among the tallest dams in the world. The scale of the undertaking was extraordinary. Millions of cubic yards of concrete were poured. Massive turbines were installed to generate electricity. The project transformed a narrow desert canyon into an immense artificial reservoir stretching across hundreds of miles of winding waterways. When the diversion tunnels were sealed and water began accumulating behind the dam, Glen Canyon slowly disappeared beneath the rising reservoir. Lake Powell eventually extended for nearly 186 miles, or approximately 299 kilometers, along the main channel, while countless side canyons became flooded arms reaching deep into the surrounding landscape. At full capacity, the reservoir could store more than 24 million acre-feet of water, equivalent to nearly 30 billion cubic meters. Supporters celebrated the achievement as a triumph of engineering. The reservoir provided water storage, hydropower generation, recreational opportunities, and operational flexibility throughout the Colorado River system. Yet questions lingered from the beginning. Some critics argued that Lake Powell occupied an unfavorable location because of the desert climate. High temperatures and low humidity create ideal conditions for evaporation. Every year, significant amounts of water are lost directly to the atmosphere from the reservoir surface. Additional water disappears through seepage into surrounding geological formations. While some seepage eventually contributes to groundwater systems, it effectively reduces the volume available for downstream deliveries. Over decades, evaporation and seepage losses have amounted to enormous quantities of water. Critics argued that storing such a large reservoir in a hot desert environment represented an inefficient use of an already limited resource. The reservoir also began trapping sediment that historically flowed downstream through the Colorado River system. Rivers naturally transport sand, silt, and other materials eroded from upstream landscapes. Before construction of Glen Canyon Dam, seasonal floods carried these sediments through Glen Canyon and into the Grand Canyon. Once the dam blocked the river, most of that sediment settled within Lake Powell. The consequences extended far beyond the reservoir itself. Water released from deep within the lake emerged colder, clearer, and fundamentally different from the river that had previously flowed downstream. Native fish species adapted to warm, sediment-rich conditions faced increasing challenges. River habitats changed dramatically. Sandbars that once formed naturally became harder to maintain. The ecological transformation affected hundreds of miles of river corridor. At the same time, Lake Powell became an increasingly important economic resource. Houseboat tourism flourished. Marinas expanded. Recreational boating attracted millions of visitors. Hydropower generation produced electricity for communities across the region. For decades, the reservoir appeared stable enough to support all these functions simultaneously. That perception began changing during the late 20th century and accelerated dramatically during the 21st century. The Colorado River Basin entered an extended period of drought, unlike anything experienced during much of the reservoir's history. Reduced snowpack, rising temperatures, and changing precipitation patterns diminished river inflows. Scientists increasingly describe the situation not simply as drought, but as aridification, a long-term shift toward drier conditions. Reservoir levels throughout the basin began declining. Lake Powell, once nearly full, experienced repeated drops. Exposed shorelines expanded. Boat ramps required extensions. Marinas relocated. Navigation channels narrowed in some areas. Features submerged for decades slowly reappeared. The decline exposed a deeper issue that had existed from the beginning. The Colorado River was being asked to provide more water than it consistently produced. Allocations established during the 20th century assumed river flows larger than modern conditions could reliably support. Population growth increased demand across multiple states. Agricultural withdrawals remained substantial. Climate change further reduced available supplies by increasing evaporation and decreasing runoff efficiency. The imbalance became increasingly difficult to ignore. By the early 21st century, Lake Powell and nearby Lake Mead functioned as giant indicators of systemic stress throughout the basin. Water levels fluctuated dramatically depending on annual snowpack and management decisions, but the overall trend reflected persistent pressure on the river system. As Lake Powell declined, something unexpected occurred. Landscapes hidden beneath water for more than half a century began emerging. Side canyons once flooded by the reservoir became accessible again. Ancient sandstone walls reappeared, springs resurfaced, waterfalls formed where tributary streams encountered newly exposed terrain. Vegetation began colonizing sediments deposited during decades of inundation. Visitors encountered scenes few living people had ever witnessed firsthand. The reemergence sparked renewed interest in Glen Canyon itself. Many sections showed remarkable resilience despite decades underwater. Native plants returned to certain areas. Biological communities began reestablishing themselves. Streams carved channels through accumulated sediments. Archaeological sites previously submerged became visible once more. Recovery was not uniform or complete. Decades of inundation left substantial deposits of mud and silt throughout portions of the canyon system. Some landscapes experienced significant alteration. Certain ecological changes may never be fully reversed. Nevertheless, the speed of recovery surprised many observers. Areas long presumed lost forever demonstrated an unexpected capacity for renewal. The phenomenon fueled debate regarding the future role of Lake Powell. Some advocates argued that maintaining a partially full reservoir no longer made sense given ongoing water shortages and evaporation losses. Others proposed rethinking storage strategies throughout the Colorado River Basin. Supporters of the dam emphasized its continuing importance for water management, power generation, and interstate obligations. They argued that Glen Canyon Dam remains essential infrastructure capable of stabilizing water deliveries during periods of hydrologic uncertainty. The disagreement reflects competing visions for the future. One perspective views Lake Powell as indispensable to basin operations. The other questions whether assumptions that justified its creation remain valid under modern climatic conditions. Meanwhile, operational concerns have become increasingly urgent. Hydropower production depends on maintaining adequate water levels behind the dam. As reservoir elevations decline, the amount of electricity generated decreases. Extremely low levels create the possibility of reaching thresholds that threaten power generation altogether. Engineers and water managers closely monitor these conditions because hydropower revenues support numerous programs throughout the region. Federal agencies have implemented emergency measures to protect critical reservoir elevations. Water releases have been adjusted. Additional water has been retained in Lake Powell during certain periods. Coordination among basin states has intensified as officials attempt to stabilize the system. These efforts highlight the growing challenge of balancing competing priorities. Every decision involves trade-offs. Releasing water downstream helps support Lake Mead and water users farther south. Retaining water upstream helps preserve reservoir elevations and hydropower generation at Glen Canyon Dam. Managing one reservoir increasingly affects conditions in another. The interconnected nature of the system means that no single solution addresses every concern. Political tensions have accompanied these hydrologic challenges. The Colorado River supports tens of millions of people across multiple states and Mexico. Agricultural regions depend heavily on its waters. Major metropolitan areas rely on it for municipal supplies. Tribal nations possess significant water rights and interests throughout the basin. As shortages intensify, negotiations become increasingly complex. Questions once considered theoretical now carry immediate practical consequences. Which users should bear reductions? How should limited supplies be distributed? Which historical agreements remain workable under changing conditions? These debates continue shaping policy discussions throughout the American West. At the center of many conversations stands Glen Canyon Dam. The structure embodies both the achievements and limitations of large-scale water engineering. It demonstrates humanity's capacity to reshape landscapes on an immense scale. It also illustrates the risks associated with planning based on assumptions that may not hold true over decades or centuries. When planners envisioned Lake Powell, they expected the reservoir to serve as a reliable bank account of water for generations. They assumed river flows sufficient to fill and maintain enormous storage facilities. They believed engineering solutions could overcome environmental variability. Reality proved more complicated. The Colorado River remains governed by natural processes that infrastructure alone cannot fully control. Snowpack varies, temperatures rise, droughts persist. Rivers respond to climate in ways that challenge long-standing expectations. As reservoir levels fluctuate, the visible transformation of Glen Canyon provides a striking reminder of those realities. Towering sandstone formations, once hidden beneath water, now stand exposed against the desert sky. Former lake bottoms support emerging vegetation. Side canyons reveal intricate geological features unseen for decades. The landscape itself has become evidence of changing conditions throughout the basin. Yet the reappearance of Glen Canyon is not simply a tale of environmental recovery. It is also a reflection of scarcity. The same declining water levels that reveal lost landscapes underscore the severity of challenges facing the Colorado River system. Every newly exposed canyon wall corresponds to water no longer present in storage. Every retreating shoreline reflects broader pressures affecting communities, agriculture, ecosystems, and economies across the Southwest. This dual reality defines the current moment. Environmental restoration and water shortage are unfolding simultaneously. For some, the returning canyons symbolize hope. They demonstrate that damaged landscapes can recover under favorable conditions. They reveal ecological resilience, hidden beneath decades of inundation. For others, the declining reservoir represents a warning about the future reliability of water supplies in an increasingly arid region. Both interpretations contain elements of truth. More than 50 years after Lake Powell reached substantial capacity, the assumptions underlying its creation face renewed scrutiny. The questions raised during the project's early years have returned with greater urgency. Was the river ever capable of supporting all promised uses? Were warnings about limited water availability sufficiently considered? Did short-term priorities overshadow long-term sustainability? The answers remain subjects of ongoing debate. What is clear is that Glen Canyon Dam occupies a unique place in American history. Few infrastructure projects have generated such enduring discussion regarding environmental costs, economic benefits, and water management philosophy. The dam transformed a free-flowing canyon into one of the largest reservoirs in North America. It altered ecosystems, reshaped landscapes, and became a cornerstone of regional development. At the same time, it submerged a canyon system many now regard as an irreplaceable natural treasure. Today, as drought and climate pressures expose portions of that lost landscape once again, the reservoir serves as a visible reminder of decisions made during a different era. Those decisions were rooted in confidence that technology, planning, and infrastructure could secure the future of the American West. They reflected a belief that rivers could be regulated, stored, and allocated with sufficient precision to satisfy competing demands indefinitely. Decades later, Lake Powell tells a more complicated story. Its shrinking waters reveal not only the sandstone walls of Glen Canyon, but also the limitations of assumptions made generations ago. The reservoir remains a critical component of regional water management, yet it simultaneously exposes vulnerabilities embedded within the system it was built to support. As the Colorado River Basin confronts an increasingly uncertain future, Glen Canyon Dam stands as both monument and warning. It represents one of the most ambitious engineering projects ever undertaken in the American Southwest. It also serves as evidence that even the largest human-made structures remain dependent upon the natural systems they seek to control. The canyons emerging from beneath Lake Powell are more than geological features returning to daylight. They are reminders that landscapes endure long after political agreements, development plans, and engineering forecasts have changed. They reveal a chapter of the Colorado River's history that many assumed had vanished forever. And with each decline in reservoir elevation, that chapter becomes easier to read.